It was about 6 months ago that my mother, who is now 80 years old, found out she had liver cancer. Surgical removal would be very risky, plus she may not be physically able to endure a major operation. With these facts in mind, my family did not tell her about it. We decided to let her live the rest of her life the way she wanted. One day, I used Google Earth on my iPad to show my mother's birthplace. It's a convenient world we live in now, isn't it? The last time my mother returned to her hometown must have been about 40 years ago. It had been so difficult for her to return, but now she can easily see the detailed back alleys of where she grew up on the internet. My mother was very impressed and was excited to see all the images. The elementary school she once attended was still lively and well. The houses where her friends used to live and the stores she had frequented were all still there. One after another, her memories came back to her, and she would tell me stories that I had never heard from her before. It's amazing that I can feel like I have been to a faraway place without having to leave the room. But then I heard something more unexpected from her. She told me that she was born in a place much deeper in the mountains than what we were seeing on the screen. According to her, there used to be a small village further to the mountains where people made their living by forestry, farming, and hunting. They lived a self-sufficient life. A sanatorium was eventually built near the village. The buildings were used to house tuberculosis patients and psychotic patients in a place with pleasant climate, and there used to be many of them, but they gradually decreased in number as its necessity disappeared with the development of pharmaceutical treatments and modern medicine. They would also function as good isolation facilities. Roads were built in conjunction when constructing the sanatorium, but this in turn led to the outflow of people from the village to bigger towns, and the village eventually disappeared as the residents moved on. Indeed, when I searched using Google Earth, I could not see any settlement that looked like that, but I did find a building that looked like the ruins of a sanatorium, tucked away among the streets deep in the mountains. I was beginning to think that it would not be a bad idea to visit this place with my mother, partly because I myself love exploring ruins. The enchanted dystopian feel is something you actually had to feel it for yourself that no picture could portray. It would probably be the last trip home for my mother. One day, I started the car with my mother as a passenger. This time it was a two-person trip and a sudden one. My father has been in and out of the hospital, so I left it in the hands of my sister, giving her plenty of pocket money. After a trip of 2 hours by car, we arrived at a port. It was a 40-hour ferry ride from here. I asked my mother to lie down and rest as much as possible on the ferry. Our plan of action for today was to quickly drive and scan through the town, making the hotel our final stop. Next morning after breakfast, we left the hotel and went for a walk in my mother's old hometown. The elementary school has been modernized and cleaned up, but the number of students have been decreasing, making the school in danger of closing completely. There were some nostalgic stores my mother used to go when she was a child, but unfortunately, we did not meet any of our acquaintances. Now it was time to go deep into the mountains where my mother was born. My car is small, but it has a four-wheel drive, which was a little pride of mine. I'd be lying if I said it was a comfortable car, but it sure does good on rough mountain roads. Cross-country driving is my specialty. However, I can't do anything reckless with my mother in a weak state in the passenger seat. I'll go as far as I can for now. We climbed up a road that looked like it hadn't been used for decades. It was covered with weed, pebbles, chestnuts, acorns, and tree branches on the surface. Occasionally, we'd see large trunks that had rotten and fallen over. The road was far from being maintained at all. At any rate, we climbed up the mountain, trying to avoid all of them. Finding what looked like the village where my mother used to live was no easy feat. My mother's memory was of her as a child, and the scenery seemed to have changed so much that she could not connect it to her own memory. I don't blame her for that. I would have been the same if I were in her shoes. Thinking about it, it was more than 70 years ago. This place used to be a bald mountain with more trees cut down, but now it's way overgrown like a jungle. We reached a certain point and could not go on by my car any longer. It was hard to tell the difference between the road and the grassy area. There were fallen trees everywhere. According to the location info on my phone, the abandoned sanatorium should be just a few more steps away. I decided to go scout there alone first. I can't hold my excitement whenever I'm near abandoned buildings. With my trusty camera in hand, I get ready to shoot any time. Mom, I'm sorry, but can you wait here for a minute? I'll be back in about 10-20 minutes, I say to her. Okay, you be careful. I leave my mother in the car and start to walk the pathless mountain. Wait, is that... Yeah, I see it. I spotted a part of an abandoned building behind a tree. The thick bushes were no taller than I was, and the plants were doing their best to cover the building. But I could see the ruin right in front of me. I think to myself, I just need to go straight. As my strides got faster, a tiny open area came into view. I could finally see the entire sanatorium in view. Just when I thought I had came across something unexpected. A line of people, maybe 10, coming out of the sanatorium. They looked rather shabby for tourists like myself. It was more like local elderly people. I wondered if this sanatorium was still in use. Reusing the ruins by the locals. I mean, it's not impossible. The lady who came out at the end of the line was carrying a picture of a child in a frame with a black belt. It looked like a photo for a funeral. A funeral in a ruin. My instinct told me to hide, so I just hid in the bushes and let them go by. The group was leaving along a different path than the one I came from. Could it be that there is still a village nearby? I thought about it, but decided to enter the sanatorium in question first. The door was unlocked. The inside was old and run down, but it was so clean that it could have been called abandoned and still in use. There seemed to be no electricity nor telephone, but surprisingly, the windows were all intact, and even if some were broken, they had been repaired or otherwise protected from the wind and rain. There were no piles of discarded trash either. The building is in a state of decay, but it had been repaired and is neat and tidy. There were so many other signs that the building was still in use. I found a stairway to the basement, so of course I decided to go. I thought it would be pitch dark, but there was a tiny window on the wall near the ceiling, so I could see well enough even in the dim light. There was a small window at the very ground level of the building, which seemed to serve as a light source in the basement. The place had an atmosphere of a hospital warehouse, and it was easy to guess that this was once a sanatorium. When I entered one of the rooms, I screamed. There was a large container made of glass, and inside the jar a human head was submerged with yellow liquid. I suddenly felt nauseous. A human head in formalin. I thought for a moment, but then I remembered that the formalin was not a yellow liquid. I looked closely and found many thin tree branches and small flowers in the container along with the head. Perhaps the yellow color was due to these flowers. But more importantly, why was the head kept in such a place? As I looked around, feeling more nauseous and horrified, I found a beautiful glass jar that looked like it was the newest. But in it was a severed head of a child, and the liquid was still fresh and clear. I looked at it and backed away and ran out. Yes, it must be the boy in the photo the lady was carrying. It must be. The head here must have been brought there by the people in the funeral procession, but not as a medical research sample. Why are they doing this? Why would they cut off the head from the body and keep it? These thoughts kept circling my mind as I retracted my steps back to the car my mother was waiting in. I finally made my way back, weaving my way through the roadless path. But then I immediately noticed my mother was gone. A surge of unease took over me, especially after what I found in the sanatorium. "Mother!" I shouted and looked around for a while. There was no answer. I started to get worried. I tried calling on my phone, but to my surprise, the bag her cell phone was in was left in the car. I got out of the car and searched everywhere, and noticed that there was a slope that I could walk down. It was possible that my mother had gone this way. I decided to follow the path. I went further and found a narrow, almost hidden path leading into the mountains, and it led to a village. There were several small, old hut-like houses, as if completely hidden from the world. There was a clearing like a village square, and a campfire was built in the middle. There was a crowd of about 10 people gathered around it. Could those be the people who were in the funeral at the sanatorium earlier? I was looking at them cautiously, and to my surprise I saw my mother crouched down in the midst of the crowd. "Mom!" I started to run. People turned around and stared at me all at once. My mother seemed to have noticed me. "Oh my, you're here too!" "Mom, you can't just leave and walk around by yourself. I was worried, sick. This is the village where I was born." "What, this?" I looked around at the people around me. "How nice of you to come back." "Yeah, who'd have thought?" The villagers were talking to each other. "I apologize for the trouble, everyone. Come on, Mom, we're going home." I didn't trust these people at all and wanted to get my mother out of there ASAP. But my mother said, "You know, I hurt my back and I can't walk." One of the villagers said, "Oh, you shouldn't move and push yourself if it hurt your back. You can stay here tonight." "Yes, and have some boar meats too with us." The people around me were trying to make us stay. "I'm sure the sanatorium will have beds for you." Hearing all this, I was screaming inside, "No, no, no, anywhere but there." My mother and I had to get out of here. No, we had to flee. I pretended to be calm and nice. "No, thank you very much, though. I've reserved a hotel in town and I'll carry my mother on my back." "Pity, you've come all this way." "If you were born here, the happiest thing would be to come back and return to dust." What were they saying suddenly? He may have meant it as a joke, but after seeing the decapitated heads in the sanatorium, it didn't sound like one at all. I felt something unbelievably ominous about all that was going on. "All right, Mom, piggyback time," I said, crouching down in front of her. "Goro, will you carry the lady?" "Yeah, sure." A man named Goro offered to carry my mother and guide us. I tried to refuse, but Goro held up a hunting rifle he was carrying and said, "There are bears around here, and it's not safe if I don't go with you. It could be dangerous without a weapon." I had no reason to refuse, so I asked them to follow me to where we parked the car. I'm not bright when it comes to guns, but I could tell that the one Goro was carrying was quite old. The wooden part was shining black. I once saw a cartoon set in Hokkaido, and it looked very similar to the gun he was holding. The program must have been set in the Meiji era, which is around 1868 to 1912. I wonder if they are still using guns from that era. "Uribos already," I hear a voice from behind. "Ah, remember to save some for me," Goro says to the old woman in front of the fire. Uribo is a baby wild boar. I once thought it would have been the cutest thing ever if it hadn't grown up. They were probably roasting it over the campfire. Eat or would be eaten, I guess. Then I took a glance towards the fire. What's that? The old woman was using something like a scratching post to scrape out the flesh of a four-legged animal that looks like Uribo from the fire. But what drew my attention was another animal that is also being roasted in the same fire. Is that even an animal? It looked like a child curled up with its arms and legs tucked in. But in the flames and without its head, it's hard to tell. Wait, hard to tell? The reason it doesn't have its head is because it was cut off and kept in the basement of the sanatorium. My head is already coming up with sinister scenarios. Just what on earth are they doing here? I wanted to scream out loud, but there was a man with a gun in front of me. If we were to be shot here, there was a possibility that we would be wiped out without leaving any evidence. So I shoved everything down my throat to take my mother and leave as soon as possible. "See you next time, everyone. I'll come again when my back gets better," my mother said, greeting everybody without a care on my back. No, wait, this was fine. Them knowing we weren't enemies is the ideal situation right now. Anyway, I just wanted to get to the car and be done with everything. With that thought in mind, I walked with a faster pace to where our car was. On the way, Goro said something to my mother, and she replied, but their local accent was so strong I couldn't understand what they were saying. With effort, we finally made it to my car. I was out of breath, but I said a word of thanks to Goro, and finally we parted ways. After turning the car around in a narrow space several times, we finally headed out from the village. As I drove, I saw Goro in the rearview mirror. What I saw made me freeze. He was aiming his gun at us. No way. I hope he was just joking. Soon the car turned a corner and Goro disappeared from sight. I immediately floored it. Thank goodness. I felt all relaxed and finally lowered my guard a little. Maybe I was overthinking. If he wanted to shoot us, he could have done it any time before we got in the car. It must have just been a misunderstanding. I told that to myself and headed down the rough mountain road. We somehow made it down the mountain and arrived at our hotel. My mind was so desperate to get out of the creepy village, and I had no memory of how I got there. My mother was mumbling something in the passenger seat, but it seemed like I was replying to her on autopilot mode. I guess I was slightly panicked when driving. Once we entered the hotel room and changed into a yukata, I felt relieved, as if everything until that point had been a bad, surreal dream. I let my guard down, but I would forever regret that I did. That evening, my mother's condition worsened, and she began to lose consciousness. I called the front desk and arranged for an ambulance. She was taken to a nearby emergency hospital. I also called my sister, but there was no way she could come in time. By midnight, my mother's condition had already become critical, and I asked my sister to at least wait until the next day to come here, telling her our mother's heart was still beating. The next morning, my sister arrived, and together we were with my mother to watch over her pass away. I never expected something like this to happen on such a trip. Mom's last regret was not to return to her hometown, so maybe she was relieved she got her wish, my sister said. I often hear people say that people just refuse to die because they have regrets. But if that's the case, does that mean that if a wish is fulfilled, then people can go to the afterlife with peace? What happened to that village deep in the mountains that Mom spoke of? The second my sister asked me that question, I felt like everyone in the hospital waiting room looked my way at once. I looked around, but maybe it was just my imagination, but the alarming and uncomfortable atmosphere had disappeared. Maybe I was too nervous. Yeah, about that. It's not going to be a short chat, so I'll tell you more about it when we get home, I said, dodging my sister's question. All of us then went home. We considered cremating her body there, but I decided against it and chose to take the body back to her hometown. We held a small funeral with just our family. There weren't many members we could gather. There were not so many people that had a direct connection with my mother's bloodline. There was no way we would contact that village. But things were moving in secret. After the wake, we headed to the crematorium. I looked at my mother's peaceful face in the coffin for the last time and said my final goodbyes. We ate snacks in the waiting room while killing time until the bones were collected. Eventually, the scheduled time came and the crematorium furnace was open for us. The cover of our mom's coffin was removed and some ashes flew up. Me and my family looked as our mother's bones appeared. A crematorium staff member quickly ran that must have been a large magnet around the area, removing many metal objects. This procedure was necessary because there could be nails and staples that had been holding the coffin in place mixed in. After that, the staff member looked at the bones again and seemed a little confused. Is there something wrong? I asked. The staff member opened his mouth with a grave tone. Usually we would first take the largest remaining skull, and I'm sorry, but we would crush it into small pieces. My blood froze with his words and looked at my mother's bones. There were small bones and large bones, but there were definitely no scar nor teeth. There's no Adam's apple either, the staff member said, puzzled. At that moment, I was filled with anger as an electric shock had hit me. Damn it! It was them! Them? My sister asked. The crematorium staff looked confused as ever. I knew right away. I don't know what method they used, but the fact that there are no bones above the neck means that someone cut off the head and took it away just before the body was to be burned. And I had an idea of who might do something like that. The head has been stolen. Call the police. The thief must have broken into this crematorium. Please investigate, I said, and tried to leave the building. Brother, where are you going? The cremation is not done yet. To the sanatorium, of course. I don't know who or how, but I know where the head is. I'm going to get it back. Brother! My sister screamed. Come to think of it, I hadn't told my sister any details yet, but I didn't have time. The talk can wait. Wait after I get my mother's head back. I can see it clearly in my mind now. Next to the glass jar that contained the child's severed head, there would be a new glass jar containing my mother's. along with flowers and tree branches. The next day, an article appeared in the local newspaper. It said that a fire had broken out in the ruins of a former sanatorium facility, and the entire area, including a nearby abandoned village, was engulfed in a forest fire. The fire was strong and had not yet been put out, but it seemed that there were no casualties.